All Jacked Up, a science fiction comedy adventure. The DIPOLE Series, Book 1. Written by Chris Lowry, narrated by Steve Downs. Chapter 1. Musk swirled below, an inexorable red cloud rolling underneath the giant space station that drifted in orbit above Mars. It was a dark stain on the red planet. Miles of 3D printed concrete buildings spread out under a protective dome that kept 50 million citizens safe. Tinker rolled around in his spacesuit and cursed under his breath. His leg was tangled in the tether, and if he didn't get loose soon, he was going to get behind. "Unit 7, the voice in the headset crackled on tiny speakers. "Go for Tinker," he grinned. "Just say go," the voice snipped. "You don't have to say your name every time." "I know," he said, as one hand flailed at a thick cord that connected him to the space station. "But you know, there are about 60 of us out here, right? I don't want you to get us mixed up." "I use your unit designation." "Oh," he said, as he flicked the cord in the vacuum to try and pry it loose from where it looped around his ankle. "Right, Unit 7, that's me. But if we're being honest..." "We're not." "It should be Unit 8.5, he giggled. "You know what I'm saying?" "I know what you're saying." "It's the size of my unit," he clarified. "I know that's what you're referring to." He finally managed to clear the loop over his ankle and free the tether back to the station. "Oh," he said. "That's why I contacted you," said the snippy voice of clean command control. "Oh, I have a problem here." The end of the tether snaked away from the space station. You could see the simple connection carabiner winking in LED light from the exterior of the station. It just floated there, looking all unconnected and stuff, which meant he wasn't connected too. Well, anything really. And that, of course, meant, "I'm falling." He keyed the heads-up display in the goldfish bowl helmet. "Help! SOS! Mayday!" "Unit 7? 8.5. He almost sobbed, on the verge of hysterics. "Unit 7, you're using too much oxygen. You need to calm down and relax. I've dispatched a rescue ranger to your location." "Shit," he grunted. 3C, I'm not in my location." He could feel himself floating away from the station. Could feel the low G of Mars's gravity grabbing his body and pulling him planet-side. There was no atmosphere on Mars, not enough to make a difference. It wasn't going to burn up on entry. He would just drift down until he ploughed into the red clay at a couple 100 miles an hour, unless he bounced off the dome. Then he might just slide along the invisible barrier and smash into the dirt at the far edge of civilized Mars. "What do you mean you're not in your location?" "I saw a smudge." "You were instructed to never leave your designated path." The snippy voice sounded even more frustrated than usual. "I know, but I figured you mates might like a little initiative." "You're a janitor, Unit 7. Your job is to inspect the station hull for dings, pits, and potential events in your designated path. It's not to investigate anything outside of that path." "But what if I saw something that could save the whole station?" Tinker said. "I'd be like a hero or something." "Unit 7, stand by. The rescue ranger has located your tracking beacon. They anticipate retrieval within 15 minutes. "Really?" he sighed. "That's great, because I really didn't want to turn into jelly on Mars or anything." "You're required to see 3C Commander upon your return." He gulped. "Is he mad at me?" "I suspect he's not going to be happy with you, but that's not the case. You're going to be charged for the rescue, I imagine." "Charged? But I don't make that much money to start with." "And he'll probably let you go." "What do you mean, let me go? I'm already let go out here, just free balling it in space." "Fired, Unit 7. You're going to get fired." "Don't I get a second chance or something? Come on, this was a little mistake." "This is your third rescue in 6 weeks. "Those other 2 don't count," he said. "They were honest mistakes." He lurched as a magnetic clamp slammed into the plate on the back of his extravehicular mobility unit. He tried to peer over his shoulder to see the retrieval ship reeling him in, but the view was blocked by the helmet that protected him from the vacuum of space. "It's been nice knowing you, Unit 7," a curt voice said over his radio. 8.5. He let out a big breath as he began moving. But right then, in the cold emptiness of space, the vast loneliness stretching beyond him to the reach of infinity, and to the spectre of unemployment looming over him, it felt more like 3.
Chapter 2. What kind of half-assed janitor are you? His boss's name was Devon, which made it sound perfect with the added moniker of douchebag. Tinker was sure he was probably a nice guy to people he liked. He liked to give people the benefit of the doubt until he got to know them. But Devon the D-bag did not like him, he decided. It didn't take much to convince him. First there was all that yelling. Tinker had hoped the firing would just be a simple conversation, a statement of fact, and well wishes of good luck all round. Seriously, that's all a firing would take. Devon the D, though, took the act of firing somebody like it was freaking Festivus. First there was the airing of grievances, a long laundry list of complaints, shortcomings, faults and mistakes made. Tinker half expected it to progress to feats of strength, where the D would try to prove he was stronger of the two, either through arm wrestling or maybe a real match. He thought about just getting up and walking out. After all, they couldn't fire him twice. He was pretty sure they couldn't. But they did have his last couple of days on a credit chip that Devon the D kept waving under his nose and around his face every time he wanted to make a point. He could really use the money, rent was due, and he owed a little bit to a very nefarious character who would make his life a living hell if he didn't get paid back, or worse. "You're right," he said, and nodded his head when the D took a deep breath before launching into the next segment of his tirade. Tinker just caught the gist of it, mostly because he wasn't really paying that much of attention. "Lazy, self-centered, slacker." He could have ticked them off on his fingers as the man shouted them out. Hell, there were probably more, but what was the use of getting upset? He had been a pilot in the war for the Martian independence and gone through Air Academy where the DI screamed with such abandon and so much creativity it would have left Devon sucking his thumb and muttering for his mummy. There really wasn't that much the boss could dish out that would hurt him, unless he withheld his credit chip. Devon held it up by his head. "I should hold out for the rescue fees," he screamed. "Do you know what they charge us every time they go out? Even for false alarms?" "It wasn't a false alarm," said Tinker. "I was unhooked and heading on an express route to Musk." Devon spluttered. "How did you unhook from the station? We have safety protocols." Tinker nodded. "I know, right? I was just as surprised as you are." Devon spluttered some more. He slammed the credit chip on the desk and grabbed a low ball tumbler full of whiskey on ice. He took a big sip, slurped in an ice cube and started choking as it lodged in his throat. He pounded his chest. "Burns going down, doesn't it?" Tinker grinned. "That's how you know it's smooth." Devon pointed at his throat as he made a gagging sound. "That's right," Tinker said. "I heard that too. Get some air rolling over the tongue and it enhances the taste. Something about the way the oxygen reacts with the molecules of the drink." Devon dropped to his knees and began bouncing his head like a chicken, working to dislodge the ice in his throat. "You okay?" Devon answered. Tinker worried about him for a second as he turned a peculiar shade of red tinged with purple. "You need me to call a rescue ranger for you?" He made a swipe for his credit chip and slid it in his pocket. As he made his way to the door, it slid open at his approach. The hacking and noise kept going behind him. "Hey, love," he called to the boss's secretary. "I think he needs some help in here." He stood back as she rushed through and checked on Devon. The man pitched over on his side and pawed at the carpet. "I don't know if you want me to call somebody," Tinker said as she hovered over the man on the floor. "He was pretty pissed that he kept charging us." The secretary drew back her foot and kicked the boss in the stomach. A chunk of melted ice sailed across the room and clattered against the wall next to Tinker. Devon took a great gasping breath of wheezing air. "Ah, looks like he's going to be all right," said Tinker. He ducked through the door and made good on his exit before the man changed his mind about credit or bills or wanted to yell at him some more. Chapter 3. The space station above Mars was as large as the city of New York back on Earth. It was a monument to the ability of man that it continued to float over Musk in a geosynchronous orbit that allowed it to serve as both a staging platform for intergalactic travel and act almost as a colony in its own right. There were parts of the station that were pristine, shiny examples of what life in space could be like. Tinker did not live in one of those parts. He lived in a seedy apartment in a seedy underbelly that aspired to be called a ghetto. Still, it was a step up from the outer colony on Mars where he was born, so he considered it moving up in the world. When he had the money, times were good. Station life was expensive, but his rent was cheap, except when he was behind. When he was behind, like he was right now, he had to sneak and hide. Certain games of chance had not gone his way, and he owed rent to his hard-assed landlady and a repayment to a small-time wannabe capo. Worse, they worked for different captains who reported to the same mob boss warlord that controlled the station. He wasn't sure who he could pay first, or who he should pay first, since there wasn't enough money for both. Tinker ducked his head as he walked and cursed Devon, the D, under his breath. The man went and choked himself, and didn't give Tinker a chance to clean out his locker before he walked out. There wasn't much inside that simple break room, except a hat, which he had been using to hide his face on his way to and from home. "How's Trix?" a voice interrupted him. "Hey, Trixie!" Tinker ducked into a doorway as he stared at the 6-foot masculine-looking woman standing on the side of the walkway. "You're home early." Trixie pulled a tube of lipstick from a pocket purse and applied it to her thick lips. "You keeping up with me, Trix?" Tinker grinned. "You know me and Alabama always have an eye on you, hun." Trixie smiled. "You have a little—" "What?" He pointed. "Lipstick on your teeth." She scrubbed it off with a big finger. "You just saved my life," Trixie squealed in a deep voice. "You know what some date would say if I give my $1 million smile and he saw that?" Tinker thought maybe a date with Trixie wouldn't say anything about a little lipstick. She was a speciality hooker, a tall transvestite in a tight leather mini-dress. Any date who wanted her didn't care about lipstick. "Have you seen Mrs. Katsopoulos?" He glanced around to see if the mention of a name made the woman appear. "No, hun, but she's looking for you." Tinker nodded. "Owe her, hun?" He shrugged. "I owe lots of people," he said. "I mean, a couple of people." "Where is she on the list?" "Top 3, he said. "And I got fired." "Again?" "It didn't match my skill set," he explained. "Weren't you a cleaning guy?" "Yeah, so?" "So anyone can clean. Hell, I cleaned before I got this line of work." Tinker rolled his shoulders. "I'm a pilot," he said. "Of what?" "I'll get a ship." "And when that happens you can give me a ride to the moon," she said. Tinker watched her root in the top half of her bra and pull out a credit chip. "Until then, let me spot you in advance." "Thanks, Trixie, but I couldn't take your money. You work hard for it." "Hun, half the time they want to talk, and the other half, I'm just acting. You take this and pay me back when you get on your feet." Tinker reached out for the credit chip. "Maybe I can just borrow a stake for a game." Trixie shook her head. "Or you could pay your rent and buy time to find another job." "Yeah, but this is high stakes," he said. "A pot could cover all I owe and pay you back with enough left over for a couple of weeks." Trixie snagged the credit chip from him and held it out of his reach. "I'm not going to loan you money to gamble. You do the smart thing and pay your landlady. You can get your stake from the first paycheck," she said. "Normal paycheck." Tinker sighed and nodded his head. She watched him for a moment. A huge grin broke her sharp cheekbones. Chapter 4. 4 of a kind. The odds of pulling a pair of aces in the deal were low. Tinker almost went all in on the first round of betting, but there was a smug little son of a bitch in a western shirt and Elvis sunglasses who won the last 3 hands, and Tinker wanted to take him for some of his money. He sat with his back to a viewport that looked over a black expanse of space. A cold, metallic gleam of the space station, a curved line stretched towards darkness. It was a good seat. Anyone sitting across from him, the self-styled king of gambling, would get distracted by the sparkle of stars, by the ships coming and going to the docks and airlocks. It was all an act, Tinker knew. just a way for the man to get an edge, and in this game any edge could help you win big. So he tossed in a chip, just a buy-in to see the turn. I'm in. He licked his lips. He really needed the money. Lot rent was due 3 days ago, and Mrs. Katsopoulos was hounding the step of his RV to collect. He had vowed last time to never be late again after his landlady made arrangements to extend him credit. Tinker wasn't sure if he could fuck a senior citizen again. It would be one thing if the former showgirl retained the toned fitness of her ancient glory, but decades of smoking and thin mints had not been kind. He shivered at the memory of sagging skin and flabby wattles as Weston's shirt put his chip in. Tell? The smug man grinned under his shades. It was unprofessional and unnecessary, as each player had seen it. The other 4 players wasted no time in debate before joining the pot. Tinker almost shivered again. Thoughts of his amorous landlady disappeared when the dealer flipped the turn to reveal a 3rd ace. He wanted to shout, "All in!" He wanted to scream, "Eat it, motherfucker!" But he counted the stack of chips in front of him with one hand. It didn't take long. He put 2 of them to slow play and hunched back in his seat. The other players studied him. A lot of pros said, "Don't play the cards, play the player." But Tinker didn't think that made too much sense. Players lied all the time, professionally. Personally, he believed in Lady Luck. Sometimes she shined on him, like this hand, just in time for rent, a couple of bills, and that red-headed cocktail waitress that kept catching his eye with a smile that said she wasn't really that shy. Sometimes Lady Luck hated him, which is how he ended up an aspiring professional gambler and unemployed anything else living in a second-hand RV. Weston's shirt shifted forward and funneled his chips into the pot. All in. He stared at Tinker. You're bluffing. The next player folded, but the other 2 jumped in, and it went to Tinker to call. He pushed his tiny stack of chips into the pot. The dealer turned a 2nd ace on the river card. Pair showing, she said. Turn over your cards. Tinker flipped over his pair of aces. Son of a bitch, Weston's shirt muttered, as the other 2 players made sounds of disgust. Tinker raked in the pot and tried not to giggle. He had hoped for rent money. He had prayed to gambling gods for a little more, for food and a few debts. As he stacked the 52,300 and some odd dollars in chips on a tray to turn in, the cocktail waitress sauntered past. Lucky duck! She shot him a grin. He held out a $100 chip. About time I had some. Thanks. She pocketed the chip and eyed the tray. I'm off in an hour. Want to get a drink? Her green eyes twinkled in neon glow of the casino lights. I'd like that. Tinker pointed to a high top in the bar across the floor. She winked and let him watch her walk away. Chapter 5. Before you ask, she said as she slid onto the stool next to him and almost made him spill his drink, my name is Bama, and no, I'm not from there. Her green eyes twinkled while her knee brushed against his thigh. We named the dog Indiana, Tinker said in a very poor Scottish accent. You have chosen poorly, she winked. Tinker laughed with her. He felt amazing. He had credit in his pocket, a cold bottle of beer on the table, and a beautiful woman to banter with. Better still, she knew movies from old Earth. Lady Luck was loving him indeed. Bama waved over to the waiter. I'd like a real beer. She lifted Tinker's bottle. And the lady's buying. Real men drink whatever they want, he defended. My silver sister will enjoy her wine cooler while you go pour me a Guinness. She sent the waiter on his way. Tinker tried not to grimace. Real beer had a cost associated with it by the time it reached exotic ports of call in the reaches of space. There were a lot of fingers in a lot of pies, and every single one of them wanted a little slice. Those slices added up, and he wondered how much credit he was going to have to part with to keep this gorgeous specimen beside him. Give me your particulars while we wait, she said. Tinker took a pull on his long neck. What you see is what you get, he said. I make my credit the old-fashioned way. Hooking? Her smile sparkled as the waiter delivered her beer. Cut-rate prices, he told her. It's the buy one, get one free business model. I'd pay for that ride. He paused with the bottle halfway to his lips and couldn't fight the grin that split from his face. I could put you on the frequent flyer plan, he offered. It was her turn to grin as her knee continued to slowly rub up and down his leg. My turn. Bama took a sip and wiped her mouth with the tip of her manicured finger. I work here and at the club, you don't know, but I'm really a businesswoman. What club? He asked. I know lots of places. She ducked her head and blushed. Cat's meow. I know it, he said. Waitress, huh? His eyes slid from her toes to her ample cleavage straining at the confines of her blouse, being too obvious to be serious. I don't strip, she whispered. Not in public. Tell me more about your businesswoman stuff, he said, and maybe I'll take you someplace private. Do you think anyone ever said I want to be a waitress when I grow up? Tinker shook his head. He didn't think many kids had that in their dream house unless mum and dad was a waiter. They don't, but we start doing it because it's easy and the pay's good. He studied her full lips as she settled them against the frost-tinged glass. I can be, he agreed, matching her with a sip of his own, although the bottle was almost empty. If you look like this, the pay can stay good, but not forever. Hence the businesswoman? Exactly. What kind of business? The easy kind. Bama waved at the waiter and held up 2 fingers for another round. I like easy, he said, as he tried to hide the sad look on his face, his brain calculating the damage to his account. I could tell. She tilted her head left in a way that was both inviting and a tease. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her hair from her cheek and tucked it in behind her ear. She leaned her cheek against his palm and locked him in her gaze. The waiter clinked down a bottle and a glass interrupting the moment. She shuddered. You feel that, right? Yeah, he forced out a croak. It's almost chemical. One hand moved to his knee while the other grabbed the dark Guinness and drank it. Electric, he agreed. I haven't felt that in a long time. Do you have some place we can go? Her fingers moved up his leg and squeezed. Tinker almost spluttered his beer. It's not much, he said. Is it private? She leaned in close and whispered in his ear. Her hand moved all the way to rest against the growing tightness in his jumpsuit. Mostly. Mine isn't, she said softly. Finish your beer and let's get out of here. Chapter 6. They barely made it through the door. The trip down the long corridor to the modified cargo hold he called home was a blur in his mind. There was kissing, he remembered, the soft feel of her lips on his, her hands all over him, groping to assure, the curve of her hips under his fingers, the electric scent of her skin against his nose. Tinker wondered how he got this lucky. It was bound to happen, he thought. The odds were, if you asked 1,000 women to go back to your place, at least one was bound to say yes. He lost count after 500, and if he wasn't so far gone into the way her hair cooled across her back of his hand, he could take a moment to add up the rest. Close to 1,000, probably. Nice place, Bama huffed in a husky voice as she glanced around the Spartan interior and worked the buttons of her blouse. Tinker slipped his shirt over his head and kissed her down the 3-foot passage to the bed space. She grabbed his face and kissed him as she undid his pants. He let them fall off his narrow hips and slid down his muscular thighs. Commando, she grinned in admiration. Only way to roll. She shimmered out of her skirt and let him appreciate her for a moment. Are you ready? She purred. Tinker gulped. His brain was on vapor lock as he stared at her. He managed to open his mouth and grunted something close to, yeah? Then she took him into her arms, and he took her in his, and the rest was lost in a sweaty blur of breathless memories. Chapter 7. He woke up next to an angel. That's how he felt. Bama sprawled beside him in all her naked splendour. He spent a few moments admiring the curve of her buttocks, the shape of her thigh, and the way her red hair framed porcelain features. He reached over and started rubbing her back. She stirred and shifted her legs wider. "Lower," she murmured, without opening her eyes. He did as she asked, moving the tip of his fingers into wider pattern until she began to make noises showing her appreciation. She rolled over and pulled him on top of her. They finished, half on and half off the bed. She giggled and grabbed his face with both hands. "I am glad I met you." She kissed him. "A sentiment I share," he assured her. "I have to go to a meeting," she said, "or I would ask you to stay." "That's very nice of you." He smacked her lightly on the bottom and kissed the boo-boo better. "Considering it's my place, don't you want to know about my meeting?" "I assumed you would tell me if it was my business." "It's about business." She rolled over and traced a pattern on his chest. "The businesswoman kind of business we almost discussed last night?" "Exactly. I'm going to meet an investor and tell him he's out." "Why is he out?" asked Tinker. "'Cause you're in." "I'm in?" "After last night," she growled and scratched his chest, leaving little red claw marks. "I want to be in business with you." "What if I'm not expanding my portfolio?" She reached down and demonstrated her powers of massage. "Honey, I can expand more than your portfolio." He reached for her again, but she rolled away. He put his arms behind her head and watched her root around for her cast-off clothes and get dressed. "Meet me later." "When? Where?" "Noon," she said. "You know your right way station?" "That's Mr. Kim's territory," he gulped. "Chicken." "Hell yeah, I'm a chicken. You cross Mr. Kim and you end up in an airlock." "Or worse," she said. He nodded as she bent over and kissed him. "But Mr. Kim isn't part of this," said Bama. "Sometimes a place to meet is just a place to meet." She drew out another kiss for a few moments until the random wanderings of his hand became a little too focused. She pulled away with a sigh. "Maybe later," she promised. "After." "After?" He fell back onto the bed and listened to her leave. Chapter 8. Tinker laid back in a crumpled mess of sheets that smelled of perfume, sweat, and sex. A grin stretched the corners of his mouth into an almost painful rictus. The pillow held traces of her hair, and the thought of her smooth skin against his lips had him ready for noon. Hopefully they could come back to his place for another afternoon of delight. A metal clank interrupted his fantasy of the memories he planned to make. He jumped out of his bed and slid into some running shorts as he hopped on one foot, then the other across the 19 feet that made up his home. He shoved the door open, ready to fight. Miss Catopolis worked on a magnetic lock to his cargo hold.
"Enjoy your guest?"
She giggled. Tinker couldn't tell if she was jealous.
"I'm too old to be jealous,"
she said off his look. The former space station showgirl could have had a mind reader's act off the strip. Her accent alone would sell the act, even blunted as it was by a lifetime spent in dim corridors of dozens of space stations scattered between Earth and Mars. "Miss K," Tinker began. She held up her hand to stop him.
"You're late. It's simple math, you beautiful boy."
Mrs. K eyed the outline of his muscles etched in his stomach.
"I need the rent, some rent, or you have to go."
Tinker stepped out onto the cold metal deck of his corridor in his one bare foot. He yelped as the cold burned and flinched up on one foot and shivered. Everything in space was cold. Everything except the memory of the woman from the night before. "Mrs. K, I've got it," he said. She held out her hand, palm up. The other hand gripped the label of a silk kimono and barely kept it closed. Fluffy house slippers completed the ensemble, and a little something else. It was all she ever wore. "I don't have it with me," Tinker lied. "I'm going to get it." She crossed her arms over her pendulant breasts and frowned.
"Did your pretty friend bring you an inheritance?"
"No such luck, Mrs. K."
"No luck for you,"
crackled the wizened crone.
"But for me, I will get very lucky to help you."
Tinker held back a shiver as he leaned against the frame of his door. "I really appreciate you working with me, Mrs. K, but things like that aren't working on me right now." He waved a hand as if to present his exhausted and used crotch. She wiggled a finger to dismiss him.
Now perhaps, after what I heard last night, I'm not surprised. But you are so young, so you will recover quickly, I think.
Tinker knew there was no arguing and bowed his head in defeat. Money, or the money shot. That's all she wanted. Okay.
Tonight?
Yes.
And take a shower,
she called over her shoulder as she swayed away.
before I cut off water and electric.
Chapter 9. Tinker stood in the corridor in Mr. Kim's section, watching the world, rose-coloured through the polarised lens of his sunglasses. Lady Luck was loving him indeed. He was still tired and a little sore from the long night of hot sex, but nothing a few hours and a few beers couldn't cure, or maybe a special concoction he could brew up on his own. Now that he had a little credit in his pocket, he could get some of the equipment he needed to build a still and make some starshine. Hell, he might even be able to bottle some and turn a little more profit on it. If he kept the margins tight and the movement on the down low, so he didn't attract the attention of the gangsters who controlled the liquor trade in space, it might work. He planned to listen to Bummer's sale pitch, ravage her repeatedly until they both couldn't walk straight, and then ask her to dinner. Maybe, over a proper date, he would consider a proposal. It was probably a scam, or maybe a direct marketing thing, but who knew? Maybe it was something legit. Not that it mattered to him. If it was a real job, one that actually paid credit, he wouldn't have a problem with it. And if it bordered on the grey side of galactic law, well, he didn't have much of a problem with that either. It didn't hurt to listen. He heard it before he saw it. A thumping bass reverberated off the corridor walls. Tinker winced as the noise assaulted his ears, assaulting every sense of composition and melody. Most residents of Space Station walked. It was a universal given when every ounce of freight cost to deliver. Only the really wealthy could afford vehicles to navigate the corridors. Even if it was a modified electric cart, he watched as a customised cart took the corner too fast. Small wheels screeched on the metal deck. Hip-hop bass thumped through the metal corridor so loud the words, melody and music couldn't be distinguished. It was just rhythmic noise and static. The cart rumbled in front of him and Bammer leaned out of the passenger seat. "Get in!" Tinker hoisted himself into an open interior that still managed to reek of weed. Not even the good stuff, but the skanky smell of cheap MJ, kept wet in plastic bags too long. The driver glared over the seat at him, but didn't turn the bass down. He was short, with pale skin and soft-looking, like a doughboy who spent too much time on a couch playing video games. He was dressed like a wannabe gangster, hat turned sideways, oversized jersey, and what looked like skorts with high tops. His glare faded to a frown to show off two gold-capped teeth. "This is Goldie," Bammer explained over the music. "That's original," said Tinker. "What?" She pointed to an ear. "Nothing," he waved her off. "We're going to buy a cheap classic ship," she screamed. "They'll hear us coming." "What?" He waved her off again. "We're going to flip it." Tinker wondered about the driver as he took off from Mr. Kim's territory and drove to another part of the space station. He didn't recognise where they were going, but that didn't surprise him. He hadn't explored most sections of the station. Not many people had. He pouted a little. The music was too loud, if you could even call it music, since all he could make out was the thump. And who was the driver? Was he an investor? Was he a partner in the deal? Something more? It was hard to think with the pounding bass so near the back of his head and the stink of skunk weed clogging his nose. Bammer slipped a hand round the side of the seat to touch his knee. It was an awkward angle and a little too secretive, but it made visions of possibilities pop into his mind. Those visions lasted until they reached a secluded section. The crowd grew thinner the further they went until they reached a docking lock on the far side of the station. The cart pulled up in front of the sliding door and Goldie finally reached up to turn the music down. The silence echoed as they creaked to a stop. "Here we are," said Bummer. She hopped out of the cart. Tinker hopped out behind her and followed. The corridor was empty as far as he could see. nice and private. Just the kind of place for a little illicit activity. Tinker thought if it were just him and Bammer, he could indulge in an outdoor fantasy. He almost put his hands out to grab her. "Hey!" Goldie said behind him. "Stick your hands in the air." Tinker lifted both hands up. "Wave them, like you just don't care." "Do you think this is funny? I've got a blaster pressed into your spine." "I do not," said Tinker. "I think it's not fair. I mean, come on. I was expecting a ship." "I've got a ship," said Goldie. "Give me your chip." "And the girl?" Tinker sighed as he pulled the credit chip out of his pocket. "At least I got laid." "You fucked him?" She sucked her breath in, but fought down the panic. "Honey," she purred, "you said to get him here any way I could. Besides, you're bigger than him." "Hey," grumbled Tinker, fingers still pointing at the ceiling above. "I am." Goldie grinned, gold tooth flashing in the dim pool of overhead LED. He slipped a hand round her waist and dragged her in front for a tongue-dripping kiss. Tinker bolted. He zigged up one side of the corridor, he zagged to the other side. Goldie screamed, but he didn't shoot. After a couple more zigs, Tinker ran straight out as hard as he could. He didn't know if he was faster than an electric cart, but he hoped he would find people first. But it might make him think twice. He figured Goldie would have taken a shot or two by now, and the wannabe gangster was content with his newfound largeness. But he didn't stop running. Chapter 10. Tinker trudged up a side corridor towards a monorail stop that ran the length of the station. It wasn't a direct line, but he figured Goldie and Bammer might use the more travelled route to look for him. He wasn't sure what they might want with him if they did. After all, they only took the credit he had, and she knew he won it in a poker game. It wasn't like he was going to the authorities to report it. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he had a couple of options. He could hit a couple of spots on the way and try to make some rent money, or he could keep going to his cargo hold and spend some time with Mrs. K to buy more time to get the rent money. Neither appealed to him at the moment. He thought he would be spending the afternoon in the arms and between the legs of a certain cocktail waitress, not broke and running. He sighed and scuffed his foot against the metal decking. Lady Luck must be pretty pissed at him. He'd been down on luck before, really up against the wall with debt collectors of really violent persuasion, but no one had ever tried to kill him before, he grumbled. Instead of playing with him, she played him for his winnings, took everything and left him with nothing, not even his dignity. Well, maybe nothing. She left him with some fond memories, and she really was good in bed, very enthusiastic, very vocal. He felt her stirring and tried to think of something else. He was going to need the freshness of that memory to help with Mrs. K if he didn't find a stake before then. Tinker needed time to think. The crowds grew thicker as he made it to more populated areas of the space station. The crowd made him feel safer, at least from the clutches of the wannabe gangster and the cocktail waitress playing Bonnie to his Clyde. He vowed to go back to the bar where she worked and get some answers, then thought of the money she took from him. She would disappear and pop up somewhere new when it ran out. It's what he would do. He could spend a lifetime hunting her, but he really didn't blame her for taking his stake. Sure, he was mad about it, but why hold a grudge? The cards turned for you or against you, and as long as there was enough money when it really mattered, well, he could handle a night with Mrs. K for a place to keep his place, and something would turn up to help him get back in a game. The casino served food and drink, so he wouldn't starve. Bammer was just doing what people who lived in space always did. They survived. Sometimes that survival came on the back of others. They said the house always wins, but he had beaten the odds before. He survived a war that thousands didn't. He even won some money playing cards every now and then. As bad as things could get, he had always come out on top. That was one of his gifts, knowing that a bad time was a situation, not a destination. People also said, "This too shall pass," which meant that things would start looking up. It was like Lady Luck was telling him he was on his way back into her good graces. He picked up his step, to head back towards his place. Chapter 11. Lady Luck may have been a fickle mistress and sometimes like a dominatrix working through rage issues, but every so often she shined on Tinker. He settled into a corner of the monorail, pout-stretched lips under a frown as he watched the loads of residents climb in or step off. Many were work-weary, exhausted after a shift, or just plain tired of living. Others looked like they were having more fun. Way more fun than him, Tinker thought. He suspected alcohol, and lots to do with it. There were plenty of stops in the entertainment district. A crowd of inebriated and boisterous salespeople clambered on and clung to each other as the train took off. Tinker watched one of the salesmen grope his co-worker, kneading her ass like it was pizza dough directly in front of his face. Tinker could have leaned forward and bit her on the butt. He thought about it, and just as he did, the salesman lost his balance. The couple fought against gravity and motion for a moment, and then, like drunks the world over, they spun around and fell straight into Tinker's lap. Laughter ensued as they tried to extract themselves. Tinker helped, and while they recounted the adventure with their intoxicated friends, he noticed the salesman's wallet resting against his leg. A thick, fat wallet with a couple of pieces of green sticking out. Not enough he could tell the denomination, but identifiable as currency. Lots of it. The worn leather rested between his leg and the plastic partition on the seat. Tinker just shifted his leg over it. It was subtle enough that he could deny it, pass the wallet back if someone called him out on it, but enough to hide it. Then he waited. No one said anything. The lump under his leg put pressure against the skin, and he wanted to rip it out and count it. Even if it were singles, the stack was thick enough to be at least 50, maybe 100. He watched the laughing salesman as he continued the groping. It advanced to whispering promises and slobbery tongue kisses, and suddenly they were making excuses to depart from the group. The monorail stopped and disgorged everyone but the salesman, his temporary girlfriend, and Tinker. They started dry humping as the train took off and almost spilled in his lap again. Tinker almost pulled the wallet out when the salesman lifted a skirt and stuck a hand down her black lace panties. It was a good enough show. They deserved a couple of the singles at least. The train stopped and the couple moved off, his hand down her panties. Tinker held his breath as they passed a metro cop. If the man stopped them, the search for ID might turn them back to the train. But the cop was roasting a drunk beggar who harassed passengers by and ignored one more drunk couple on their way back to a besotted shagging session. The doors closed and the train took off. Tinker closed his eyes and sent up a quick prayer to the gambling gods, Lady Luck especially. He fished out the wallet and began counting. Chapter 12. Tinker stood in front of the flickering neon, bleeding off the sign in front of the Cat's Meow. He thought he should probably go someplace else, on the off chance that Bama and a hip-hop-clad little man she called a boyfriend showed up. But he knew there was a game here, and he had the buy-in smouldering in his pocket. If he did a quick couple of hands of Texas Hold'em, and the gambling gods were kind, he could catch up on rent and pocket a little for another night. There really wasn't enough time to hunt up another game, so it just made sense, he reasoned. He paid the membership fee at the door and moved through the Christmas-like coloured interior. It wasn't too crowded yet, still early for the nightlife to pick up. Got a blueberry wheat? He pressed up to the sweat ring-stained bar. We have beer, the inked-up bartender shouted back over the thumping echo of pulsating techno. Tinker held up one finger and watched a skinny man pull a draught of foamy yellow liquid into a cracked glass. He dripped it on the bar in front of Tinker and pointed to the neon blue free beer sign over one shoulder, then to the tip jar with his other hand. Tinker stuffed a couple of bills into the pitcher. I heard there's a game here, he said. Incarms, the beer man, gave him the fish eye. Tinker wrestled another bill out of his pocket and stuffed it in the jar. He got nothing from the bartender. He repeated the bribe with a one-up denomination. That seemed to do the trick. He turned another finger point, this time to one of the 3 doors on the back wall. Tinker gave a weak toast with the weaker beer to say thank you and carried the leaking mug towards the back. It opened to a short hallway that must have been soundproofed, because as he shut the door, the techno thump fueling the stripper's gyrations was muted. He then took 10 steps to a second door and opened it to a smoke-filled room. 6 men sat around a worn and cigarette-scarred felt-topped table. No one glanced up as he stepped in. A little man at the head of the table made a small gesture with his chin. 2 thick giant hands grabbed Tinker and frisked him. He was spun around to face the stone visage of a towering bodyguard. The man's hands were rough and efficient as they roamed over Tinker and divested him of his bankroll. 2 of the men at the table shifted apart to make room. The bodyguard stepped back into the shadows by the doorway. Tinker grabbed a chair from the wall and sat at the table with a grin. Chapter 13. The velvet-padded door opened to admit them into a pink and purple room. The little man from the poker game led Tinker inside, being herded from behind by the towering bodyguard. Jaeger's taste seemed to run along Prince themes. With a solid matte black wall behind the giant desk, black lights were strategically positioned to give the room an alien feel. Teeth and eyes flashed in an otherworldly glow. "Sit," Jaeger instructed. Tinker settled into a long pleather chair and slid back at an angle until his knees were almost as high as his chest. It was designed by a German torture artist, thought Tinker, perfectly selected by Jaeger to put the person in a seat at an awkward angle and a lower position. To make matters worse, Jaeger perched on the edge of his desk so that a little man towered over Tinker.
"That was a fortuitous hand, mister."
"Just Tinker," said Tinker.
"Yes, Tinker."
The tiny gangster smoothed his pencil-thin moustache with 2 fingers.
"I assume I need no introduction."
"Afraid so," shrugged Tinker.
"You do not know who I am?"
Tinker shook his head.
"Nor my proclivities?"
"Afraid not." Jaeger smiled. It didn't touch his eyes.
"As I said, most fortuitous."
"For you?"
"I want you to do something for me."
Tinker pushed further back in his chair. "I don't suck dick, man," he said. "Not my thing."
"Do I appear to you like a man who likes another man to suck his dick?"
"Appearances can be deceiving."
"Correct."
Jaeger smiled.
"And propose as well. I am not what I appear to be."
"Are you a cop?"
"Do I look like a galactic officer?"
"You do not."
"And you do not look like a professional gambler. Yet time after time word of you spreads on rumour's wigs."
"So you're a poet?"
"Sometimes." Jaeger shrugged. "Sometimes I pimp. Mostly I play poker in the businesses I run. Not enough against men like you."
Tinker nodded his appreciation. "High praise from a poet, pimp, poker man," he said. Jaeger nodded to the bodyguard. The giant man opened the door to admit 4 women, a blonde, a dark-skinned brunette, what looked like a teen, and a Trixie.
"Do you want a blowjob while we discuss business dealings?"
Tinker waved him off. "Is that a kid?" The man in the dress growled and took a step towards Tinker with a clenched fist.
"Annie,"
Jaeger warned. "I'm 23, asshole," said the teen looker-hooker. Annie stepped back, but the tension off her body came in waves.
"I do not deal in children,"
Jaeger explained.
"though there are some who pay extra for the look."
Tinker grunted. Jaeger sat in the chair behind the desk, followed by the blonde. She kneeled in front of him. Tinker heard a quick zip as she casually undid the gangster's pants.
"That last hand made you owe me a great debt."
Annie shifted her position to stand next to the bodyguard.
"I'm going to ask you to satisfy that debt with a favour."
He held up a finger on one hand while the other moved to rest on top of the blonde's head.
"Get a drink,"
Jaeger instructed. He stood up and zipped up.
"Let's take a walk,"
he told Tinker. Chapter 14.
"What do you think?"
They stood at a window that overlooked the docking station. A low-slung, sleek cargo ship was tethered to the dock. Tinker stared with wide eyes. "She's beautiful." Tinker wanted to whistle at the lines.
"Like I do not know,"
Jaeger shot back. Trixie and the bodyguard hauled in a sealed cargo box and set it between them. Jaeger walked around the box, trailing his finger along the edges.
"There is an item in the trunk which I would like you to dispose of."
Tinker smirked. "You got a body in there." Jaeger slid the silver shades he wore down to the tip of his nose and peered over the edge at Tinker.
"And if I did?" Tinker shrugged. For argument's sake, Jaeger continued, let us say there is a body in the trunk, which I have asked you to dispose of to satisfy a substantial debt that you owe to me. What would your response be to a request of this nature?
Tinker took a moment to glance at the silent bodyguard standing vigil near the hood, then back to the small man in front of him. There was no good answer, or only one answer that would be good enough. For argument's sake, Tinker said, I owe you big time.
It is quite substantial.
Tinker nodded. So long as whatever might be in the trunk is already dead and it makes us square, I can't say no. Jaeger lifted an eyebrow in his bodyguard's direction. The man shifted his head in a passing reference to a nod.
It is. It does. You don't.
He motioned Tinker to the airlock door.
I could just pop the trunk out of the lock, the gangster said. But from here it could be retrieved, and that might raise questions.
He glanced over at Tinker.
I don't like questions.
Who does? Questions can be so annoying. Jaeger keyed to open the airlock. Tinker half expected to be sucked through the opening, even though he knew safety measures wouldn't allow the inner or outer hatch to be opened at the same time. Even if there were emergency doors in place to shut down to prevent too much damage to the station. Still, it was unnerving. If there were overrides, he was sure a gangster would have them, and know how to use them. All he saw through the airlock was a small passageway to where the ship was tethered.
Return it by 3, said Jaeger. Washed and waxed.
Got it, Tinker said. He held out his hand for the command key. Jaeger held a small disc above his palm.
I like this ship, he said. A lot.
Tinker gulped. I'll be careful, he said.
See that you do.
He took the command key and marched across the airlock to the tether door. The inner door of the ship opened to the code embedded in the key. Tinker stepped inside to a spacious cargo area. He watched as the bodyguard and Trixie wheeled the box inside and secured it next to the open door.
Careful,
Trixie whispered as she left. The bodyguard gave him a dubious look before he left him alone in the ship. He could see 3 doors off the cargo space. One to the cockpit at the front of the ship. A quick peek in the other 2 revealed a captain's quarters and a bathroom. He sighed and settled in the pilot seat. It moulded to his bottom, just as it had been designed to do. But to Tinker, it felt like it was made for him. He gripped the small yoke. The indentations wrapped his fingers like a glove. Mama, I'm home, he whispered. He keyed in the ignition sequence, sealing the door. Chapter 15. The ship handled like a dream. Not that he did any real steering. He keyed in a course sequence on the onboard computer, used updated navigation coordinates to chart the course. Tinker held the yoke in his hands anyway. It took almost half an hour to move to the far end of the space station. The fat red planet drifted on the edge of his vision in a porthole. He wasn't going to deep space, though he was tempted. The ship felt good. He felt good. And there were plenty of other stations where he could get lost. A small-time gangster like Jaeger might find him. Then again, he might not. There wasn't much loyalty amongst thieves, and honour was the name of a stripper on a pole. He figured he could get away with the ship and get to being nefarious. Maybe make a name for himself, make a little credit, and spend it where it mattered most, on women and whiskey. And if he could make his own shine, he could use all the credit on women. He leaned back in the seat and smiled. Dumping a dead body in a frozen waste of space was a small price to pay. Hundreds of people went missing on space stations each year. A lot to accidents, and the bodies were found years later. A lot more to dealing with the mobs that controlled the unofficial traffic that moved from Earth to Mars, and the floating cities that existed between. Even though he didn't particularly believe in ghosts, he shivered. If they were real, there would be plenty out here to witness him adding another to their number. He waited until the station was a dot in the viewport just to be sure he was far from prying eyes. There was no way the naked eye could make out detail in the vacuum of space, but that didn't stop thousands of cameras from clicking in every direction. He wanted to keep the cameras focused on the far side of the ship, so drifted the door starboard and set it on autopilot. Tinker went back to jettison the cargo. The black blocks were slightly smaller than 6 feet, as wide as a coffin, and he wondered about the dead guy inside. "Sorry about this, bud," Tinker said as he knocked on the lid. Something kicked back. Hard. Tinker hopped away from the box with a high-pitched yelp. "Space zombie!" he breathed as he brought his heart rate under control. All right, he was pretty sure it wasn't a space zombie, at least reasonably sure. He looked around for a weapon and lifted an all-tool pry bar from a cubby in the wall. If it was a space zombie, he could brain it. And if it was another gangster, pissed about being locked in a box, about to be shot in space, he could brain him too. It sure beat getting beaten up. He dashed in to open the trunk and stumbled back. Bama was curled in a fetal position, duct tape across her mouth, around her wrists and ankles. She stared up at him with saucer-sized eyes and screamed through the gag. Tinker yelped and slammed the lid down. What was she doing in the box? How did this happen? "What the hell?" he yelled at her through the lid. Tinker turned the latch and opened the box again. Yes, it was Bama, curled up in there. She was tied up, gagged, and mascara smeared her tear-stained cheeks. He eased her out and propped her against the car on unsteady legs as he peeled the tape off her mouth. "I bet this is good," he said. "You win that bet for sure." She gnawed on the tape, holding her wrists, while Tinker freed her ankles. "Give me the short version," he said. "I fucked with the wrong midget." She scrubbed her cheeks with dusty palms. "I'm gonna need a longer version," he told her. "Did you try to get him to invest too?" "Sort of." "Did he kill your pet gangster?" She giggled. "No, but Goldie owes him big time. That's what my money was for. It was supposed to be, but Goldie took off with it. All of it." "Some friend." "He can't help it," she sniffed. "He's an addict. He's got a gambling problem." "So he went to piss away my money?" "Or double it. That's always the plan, to double our money." "My money? What did you do while he did what he did?" "I went to explain and tried to trade." She ran a hand across her crotch to indicate the region. "For more time." "Then how did you end up in a trunk?" "That little fucker had a string of lot lizards come in and let one suck him off while I watched."
That must be his MO.
"You saw it." "4 girls," said Tinker. 3 girls and a man in a red dress." "That's Trixie. She's my neighbour." "Like you wouldn't believe." She stared at Tinker for a moment. "How much do you owe him?" she asked. "A lot." She leaned against him, and he let her rest her head on his shoulder. "He wanted you to kill me. You were supposed to be dead." "Then why are you out here?" "That's the confusing part." Bama slid a hand into his pocket and felt around. "I'm sure it's not for that," he said, glancing around, "but we might get away with it." "Command keys." She dug in his other pocket. He let her look for a few moments as they stared into each other's eyes. Sure, she robbed him, and sure, he was supposed to hide her dead body in the outer space, but pheromones don't care about that. "In the cockpit?" he indicated with a nod and a grin, but Bama kept looking for a few moments more. Chapter 16. "What are we going to do?" "I've got to take the ship back." "Do you know how much we could sell that for?" She blinked sand away from her green eyes. "This guy tried to kill you once. Technically, he wanted you to kill me. Or something. I told him I wasn't killing anyone." "Maybe it was a test." She glanced at the radar screen on the monitor. "For what?" "Does he want you to work for him? Is that how he gets you? Blackmail you into doing what he wants?" "I didn't do anything except owe him money. Now that you know, you're not dead and buried." "That's why we should run. Take the ship and get out of here." "We don't have money to run," he answered, but he was surprised to find out how close her thinking mirrored his. He had no job and no way to pay for a place to stay except trading his body for it, something he was loath to do and wasn't sure he could do it. The thought of Mrs. K made everything shrink inside of him. Running away with Bama on a spaceship held a certain allure. The physical proximity would be a welcome activity on the journey. Combine that with he couldn't rob her again, and the merit of the idea kept growing in his mind along with other things. They could make long, sweet love in the moonlight until they rustled up some stake money and he could find a game. Maybe she could work a hustle with him, something to get some cash from tourists. Just a little bit, just enough. The drunk bit worked quite well. As long as she didn't let go too far, he thought he could pull off the part of the paramour. "Going to kill me again," she said, "and you too for not paying him back or doing his dirty deed." She was right. Jaeger was not the type to let bygones be unless they got gone. "Let's go," he agreed. She squealed and threw her arms around his shoulders and wrapped him in a kiss. Her lips were full of promises, and the way she ground against him let him know the weight to collect would be worth it. He moved into the pilot seat and keyed in a new course sequence. "What's that?" He tapped a blinking red light. "Proximity alert," Bama said. He saw she wasn't looking at him. She was watching the viewport monitor as the ship docked against them with a loud metal clang. The hum of the vacuum seal vibrated through the hull and the airlock door hissed open. "Shit," Tinker said. "Shit," Bama agreed. Jaeger stepped through to the cargo space with his bodyguard, Trixie, and Goldie. The bodyguard did his best imitation of a 1,000-yard stare as Trixie shoved Goldie to the floor of the ship. He fell to the ground in a heap and picked himself up, dusted himself off. "Circumstance calls for strange bedfellows," Jaeger said off Tinker's look. "You opened the box." Tinker put his hands up. The Romanian gangster pimp didn't scare him so much as the hulking bodyguard with the blaster pointed at him. Goldie screwed up his eyebrows and curled one lip up.
"What are you doing with him?"
Goldie growled. Bama slid over to the door and stared at her gangster boyfriend. "Where did you go?" she pouted.
"I had things to do," said Goldie. "Places to be."
"I went to him to help you."
"I know, baby, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry."
"He was going to kill me."
"That's what he told me, baby. That's why I'm back, to rescue you."
Tinker thought he might throw up. He wanted to run, but the blaster deterred him. That and the fact that there was no place to run except the pilot's quarters, the bathroom, or the cockpit. But one look at the bodyguard in the pickup cart kept him rooted in place. The man had produced a blaster that was casually resting on the edge of his hip, just the tip of the barrel peeking out in his general direction. Tinker was pretty sure the guy could shoot, and even if he couldn't, why bother taking the chance? "I didn't need rescuing," Bama snarled. "I had that part taken care of." "Way to go, Bama," he wanted to shout. Instead, he tried to hide a grin.
"Here I am anyway."
Goldie curled his lip.
"Touching," interrupted Jaeger, "but there is a matter of business to discuss, and I am growing tired of being out here."
He turned towards Tinker.
"It seems you have not satisfied your debt to me yet."
"She wasn't dead."
"Alas," said Jaeger, "we can take care of that."
The bodyguard shifted his blaster. Goldie and Tinker shouted "no" at the same time and moved for Bama. But Trixie grabbed Goldie and jerked him back. The pistol moved on Tinker and he froze, hands shot up in the air. He wasn't going to smart off this time. "He took my money." Tinker nudged his head at Goldie.
"Is this a true statement?"
Jaeger turned to the gangster. Trixie twisted his arm up against his shoulder blade and yanked a little harder than necessary. Goldie moaned.
"Yes. Would you be so kind as to hand it over?"
Goldie used his free hand to pull out the credit chip and handed it to Jaeger. "It's not doubled?"
"I came to save you." "I called him to save you," said Jaeger. "Your story of a recently acquired largesse touched me, which is why you were in a box without a blast hole accessorizing your attire."
"What now?"
Tinker asked. You have satisfied your debt to me. Jaeger tossed the credit chip to the bodyguard. A swift hand snatched it out of the still air and secreted it away in a pocket. You still owe me, he said to Goldie, and he shoved him towards the open hatchway to the other ship. Get the command key to my ship, Jaeger ordered. Goldie grunted as he massaged his shoulder, but he shuffled across the cargo ship to the cockpit and did as he was told. He disappeared through the passageway and leaped back out, a small compact blaster held sideways in his hand. Eat later, mother! He didn't get to finish the rest as a shot from the bodyguard vaporized half his skull. The other half sent an arc of crimson liquid across the cargo deck and painted a splash of red on the wall as the body toppled over. Tinker took a look and bent down as his stomach rebelled at the sight. There wasn't much because he hadn't eaten, but it was enough to make a mess. I can't watch people sick,
Trixie retched and sent her own lunch in a sliding spurt next to Tinker's.
Jaeger turned away while Bama stared at the leg of her now dead boyfriend as it twitched on the floor. The bodyguard just watched, bored. I'm going to need another favour. Jaeger raised his hand as he tucked Bama under his arm. He held up 2 fingers as he ticked them off. Get rid of the body and clean up this mess. Trixie patted Tinker on the back as she followed her boss and the others back into the ship. Bama went with them, and Tinker thought she didn't look like she was protesting too much. Spotless, Jaeger called back down the passage as the door whisked shut and locked Tinker in with the dead man and all the smells. Then it got worse as the muscles in the body relaxed with a final twitch and turned even more mess loose on the smooth deck. Tinker rushed to the casino portion of the space station. The trip back to the far side ate the last of the fuel for the trip, and he was low on funds. He didn't even have enough to pay for the cleaning crew and had to make do with cast-off rags and water he begged for. Still, if he could get in and out, he had a plan. And if he ran into Jaeger or any of his gangster friends, he could play dumb. Not that it would be too hard. The casino had redecorated since the last time he walked in, but why they chose orange and red squares escaped him. Probably something to do with the cost of shipping. He spied a token on the floor and picked it up. He couldn't buy his spot in a game, and he needed a stake to get fuel and disappear. He stopped in front of a slot machine, slid the token in the hole, and pecked the button. The digital screen whirred, settling on 2 cherries and a wild card. Alarm sounded as coins jangled into the tray below. 1 token. What luck. Now he could pay for a little fuel, enough to get to the next station, and he could hustle up a side job to make his nut. He pressed the credit chip against the reader and watched the numbers tick up. It was more than he thought. Plenty for what he needed, and a little left over. He knew about his standing game in the back of a strip joint, only 3 sections away. A slot payout would be enough to buy fuel and buy in. Hell, the way Lady Luck was working right now, she'd be pretty pissed if he didn't try the game. After all, she just rewarded him with a payout from the slots with just 1 token. He could just get fueled up and find a game on another station. That would be a smart move. But it would be disrespectful to ignore that kind of a sign from the gambling gods. There was the smart thing to do and the right thing to do. He knew which one would win.
This has been All Jacked Up, a science fiction comedy adventure. The Dipole Series Book 1. Written by Chris Lowry, narrated by Steve Downs, copyright 2019 by Christopher D. Lowry, production copyright by Christopher D. Lowry.